I want to welcome you to my new course for the teaching company, 36 Events That Have Changed History. The world was never the same. And we are going to explore 36 events which, in my opinion, either changed history or embodied the forces that have changed history. Like all of my courses with the teaching company, this is a very personal course. It represents my personal view of history. And as I've told some of you before, I am quite convinced that history is not made by anonymous social and economic forces. It is made by great individuals, great ideas, and the great events that are propelled by these individuals and by these ideas. In famous Greeks, famous Romans, Winston Churchill, we have looked at great figures in history. In a history of freedom, in the wisdom of history, life lessons from the great books, books that have made history, we have looked at the great ideas. In this, we are going to study the history of the world in terms of the great events. In choosing great events, I have been guided again by my own wisdom and ideas. I think an event should be described, one, if in itself it fundamentally changed history and was important. Two, if the aftermath shows that history was changed by that event. And thirdly, that event still reverberates with us today. For always, the best reason for studying history is not the accumulation of facts. It is to use the lessons of the past to make decisions in the present and to look into the future. We begin our course with the beginning of history, the event that changed everything that came afterwards, the birth of civilization. It occurred first in the Middle East. And our course will take us again and again to the Middle East. The crucible of conflict, the graveyard of empire, and in this case, the nursery of civilization. There were two great revolutions that brought civilization into being. The first was around 8000 BC, when the human race in various parts of the world, but first of all in the Middle East, began to settle down, transform themselves from being hunters and gatherers with very limited quantities of food and very seasonal, into being farmers who lived in villages, were thus stable, and had a relatively stable amount of food. Now that changed history forever. We still live with the reverberations of that fundamental discovery, that you can grow crops on a regular basis, you can domesticate animals and eat them and breed them. And this then enables a number of people to carry out other tasks, let's say making weapons, without having to grow their own food. But in 3000 BC, another great step in history occurred. In Egypt, as well as in the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, Mesopotamia, Iraq of today. There in both Egypt and Iraq, with a good deal of mutual exchange of ideas and techniques, the fundamental elements of civilization came into being. One, complex government structures. Two, the use of metal, the ability to work metal, to create bronze tools, and with those bronze tools, to build monumental structures like the pyramids, like the Tower of Babel described in the Old Testament. Writing. And with that, a fifth element, the ability of these complex governmental structures to organize and make use of labor, and thus to increase the size of the population. These developments changed the world. They were never forgotten, and they are with us today. You're right. That ability to transmit knowledge, to pass it down, shaped history forever. It brought into being great works of literature like the Divine Comedy of Dante. And it brought into being the first class of bureaucrats. And the first bureaucrats we encounter are there in Mesopotamia and Egypt, starting already around 3000 BC. And every time you look at a skyscraper, your mind should go back to the pyramids that were erected to celebrate the majesty of the Pharaoh. But this was new technology. And we have a dangerous delusion today that technology creates freedom. And that the more technology we have, the more democracy and freedom is going to exist. Well, that's not what happened with the beginning of history. And of course, the beginning of history meant that with writing, you could write down history. And most interestingly enough, the first historical record from ancient Egypt, going back to around 3000 BC, describes the conquest by bloody war of Egypt by one great ruler, King Narmer. And the birth of civilization in Egypt came about not through democracy, but by an all-powerful Pharaoh. And indeed, it may very well have been climactic change, a loss of arable land, and the need felt by large numbers of people there in Egypt to channel the waters of the Nile, hydraulic engineering, so that the Nile could be on an annual basis and on a daily basis a source of supply of water to the fields of Egypt. And a democracy could not solve this question. So a great man, King Narmer, united the land, organized the people, got the hydraulic engineering in place, and in return, he was recognized as absolute ruler of Egypt. That is in fact how Herodotus in the 5th century BC already described the origin of civilization. One very capable individual making use of technology to help large numbers of people and yet at the same time become all-powerful. And throughout the long centuries of Egypt, throughout its 3,000 years of history in the ancient world, Pharaoh was God on earth. His lips were effective power. He was law itself. And with that law, he built the pyramids. Writing was invented in a very short period, almost as though this all-powerful CEO of Egypt said, I want a means for recording all the tax and tribute that is brought into me. I want it on my desk by the end of business tomorrow. And writing was invented. And the first records from Egypt, along with the king beating in the heads of his enemies and chopping their heads off, are bureaucratic accounts. And so too in 3000 BC, similar change of climate in Mesopotamia meant a loss of good land for crops, and the same need for hydraulic engineering, and the same organization of labor by those willing to accept absolute rule rather than democracy. In Egypt, the birth of civilization was marked by a unified kingdom, and the Nile allowed for that kind of unity. But in Mesopotamia, the earliest civilization arose in separate little city-states, a walled city surrounded by land that could be farmed. Cities like Ur, later on cities like Babylon. The earliest inhabitants of Mesopotamia in the time that the birth of civilization occurred were the Sumerians. Their language is one we can read, but we still do not understand its origins or where the Sumerians originally came from. But their civilization was developed further. The Sumerians were ultimately brought under the rule of Semitic speakers, using the language Akkadian, and the first real empire in history grew up there in Mesopotamia, in which the various small cities were one by one conquered and united. And by the year 1700 BC, the first superpower had occurred. Egypt was a superpower as well, but until about 1400 BC, the Egyptians were not especially expansionistic in terms of trying to conquer the rest of the Middle East. But in Mesopotamia, from the beginning, in what we call Iraq today, from the outset, there was a desire to conquer and consolidate, and create a multicultural, diverse empire. And by 1750 BC, this multicultural, diverse empire had reached a golden age under the rule of King Hammurabi of Babylonia. An empire that stretched throughout all of Mesopotamia, that had taken what was best in Sumerian culture and married it with the culture of the Semitic Akkadian speakers. And so great was the grandeur of the city of Babylon that it gave rise in the Old Testament to the story of the Tower of Babel. And in fact, in 1750 BC, there were these huge pyramid-like structures rising up to the gods of Babylonia, to the great god Marduk, Shamash, and the other gods like Ishtar. It was also an age of cultural creativity. And the Mesopotamia of Hammurabi knew the magnificent poetry of the epic Gilgamesh, an epic that took us right back to the earliest of human thoughts, the question of, why must I die? And in fact, in Egypt, it was this desire not to die that led the pharaohs to create their pyramids. And in Mesopotamia, it was believed that the very beginning of humankind had tried to find life everlasting, that it had once lived in a paradise that had been destroyed by a flood. And then men like Gilgamesh had wandered the world trying to find the secret of eternal life and failed, and came back to realize that all we can really achieve is what a man does himself. Like create the walls that surrounded Babylon, like conquer other territories, or like Hammurabi, create the first code of law. And one of the most enduring contributions of ancient Mesopotamia, one that reverberates with us every day of our lives, is the idea of a written code of law. And the first really extant, detailed code of law was issued by Hammurabi in his effort to govern justly this vast empire of Babylonia. We can still study it. It is there written for us in the Akkadian language in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped like writing of the age of Babylon. The best preserved example is in the Louvre in Paris, where we have almost 300 of the articles of this code of law issued by Hammurabi. Law. You know, every day the law is with us, and fundamental concepts of the law. The traffic ticket. You will go out today, leave your job, and there will be this little yellow ticket. And you have rights under that code of law. You can appeal it. Go home tonight and maybe you have on the television preserved for yourself an afternoon show about trial. Some couple arguing over custody of a child. These reality TV trial shows have an enormous hold upon us. And of course, there are the celebrated trials that come up again and again in the course of our civilization, so eager for any kind of entertainment. But the law in and of itself is a noble profession. And the idea of a written law is one of the most powerful concepts in history. And Hammurabi already understood it. At the very beginning of his stele, because it's carved in stone, is a portrait of Hammurabi receiving this law code from the great god Marduk, supreme lord of Babylonia. So the king himself got the law from God, the same way that Moses, as we shall see in our second lecture, received the law of God from the hand of God. So there's Hammurabi, shown much smaller than the god Marduk, receiving these tablets of law. And then the grandiose titles of Hammurabi. I am Hammurabi, king of Babylon. I am the chosen of the great god Marduk. I have been chosen to rule over the four corners of the universe by the counsel of the gods. I am all victorious, and under my conquering command the armies of Babylon have swept widely. They have brought many new areas of the world under the control of the gods of Babylon. I am the chosen of Marduk here on earth, and it is his command and his will that I rule with justice for all of my citizens. There, that idea, that the ruler, the government, is accountable to a high authority, the god Marduk, and has the obligation to rule for the benefit of all of his subjects. And this is the first law code that deals with a multicultural empire and with the idea that every individual in that empire, regardless of status, has rights that are written down and therefore cannot be changed. And in fact, that is what Hammurabi says. I have placed these law codes, these great stelae, in every city of my vast empire, so that every one of my citizens can come and stand before them and read or have read to them what their rights are, and so that no one can change the law and oppress those who are weak. The Code of Hammurabi is not alien to us. There are parts of it that are strange to us today that aren't usable, but it also contains fundamental elements that mark our freedom under the law in the United States today. And there is nothing really comparable to it in the early civilization of China or in the early civilization of India. And there's nothing comparable to it in Egypt, because each pharaoh was a law unto himself. But there in Mesopotamia, we find first the idea that government is under the law. The king himself must obey the law because it has come from God. And therefore that there is a limit upon the power of the ruler. Time and time again in this country, we have presidents who think they're above the law, but they are as much obliged to pay a traffic ticket under the law as you are. If they break the law, they will find themselves charged as criminals. So the government is under the law, already enshrined there in the great Code of Hammurabi. Secondly, the idea that the law does not change. Greeks said the law is king. And in the Code of Hammurabi, he swears the most awe-inspiring curses against anyone who will overthrow that law, tear down those stelae, the same way that our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Now, the founders of our country were wiser than Hammurabi. They realized that there should be a careful process for amending the Constitution, but the notion is still profound to us that the law is the law. So, government under the law should not be changed willy-nilly. And then if an attorney would take the time, and to repeat, being an attorney along with being a doctor is one of the noblest of professions, if an attorney would sit down and study the law code of Hammurabi, they would see that the various articles of the code fall into recognizable legal terms of today. They are terms that an attorney could specialize in. They begin with a criminal code. Punishments for murder, punishment for theft, punishments for striking another person, punishment for an accident, even if inadvertent, that cost another person their eye or their hand. Now, what is generally said about the law of Hammurabi whenever it's mentioned is how harsh it is. The idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, the code makes it quite clear that victims have rights. And if you have caused another human being to suffer, you should suffer in a similar way. So we may think it's harsh. Hammurabi might tell us that we completely neglect the victim to give all the rights to the one who commits the crime. So yes, if you cause an individual to lose his hand, your hand can be cut off. If a nurse is negligent or takes 2 jobs and cannot provide enough milk to suckle 2 children, and one of them dies, then her breast will be cut off. If you steal, you must pay restitution tenfold over. The code also makes clear that a judge has responsibilities, and a judge must be trained. And if a judge in a criminal or any other kind of offense gives a written decision, and that too is important, the decision must be written down for all time. If the judge gives a written decision and it later turns out he has made an error, then the judge will be removed from the bench, fined 10 times whatever he has fined the person he found against, and never allowed to be a judge again. So the judge held to the strictest of standards. And then what again might strike many people today as being cruel, if I kill your daughter, then you have the right to take my daughter and kill her. Of course, that's harsh, but the idea behind it is there is no greater pain for a parent than to lose a child. And if I kill your daughter or if I kill your son, and then I am simply executed, well, the grief is immediate to me. I'm dead, but then I don't know anything more about it. No, the idea behind this law is that you have killed my daughter and you're going to go on for the rest of your life feeling the same pain I do because your daughter has been taken away. Commercial law, very highly developed in the Babylon of Hammurabi. It was a time of a free market economy in some ways. Caravans that are already described again in the book of Genesis, making their way across the Middle East, bringing spices, silks, other objects. And the commercial code is very clear. For example, if you are acting as my agent, I give you money to carry out a transaction on my behalf in another city. You come back and have lost this money by a foolishly bad transaction, then you have to pay the money back to me. Even if you've done it well, if you have squandered the expense money I gave you, in other words, used it improperly, you have to pay that expense money back to me. And there is a clear guarantee of contracts. The sanctity of the contract. It must be 1, written down, and 2, witnessed. Absolutely familiar to us today. So no receipts, no reimbursement without receipts. You better get a signed contract. If you do not have a signed contract and you claim that this gentleman has taken money from you under false pretenses, if you cannot provide either the signed contract or two impartial witnesses to swear that this agreement was made, not only do you not get restitution, you have to pay the court cost. So a well-developed commercial code and a family code, including, again, the harsh concept to us, but one that resonates with the biblical commandment, honor your father and mother. If a son strikes his father, that son's hand will be cut off. The code recognizes the absolute sanctity of adoption. And if you have adopted a child, sign the contract that you have adopted that child must receive exactly the same inheritance as every one of your natural children. The rights of women are protected. If your daughter should choose a life of prostitution, you cannot cut her out of the will. She is entitled to exactly the same sum of money as is inherited by either your reputable daughters or your sons. So, family law, very highly developed. The rights of a woman if she is divorced. She must get an appropriate property settlement unless she is found guilty of adultery. And if her husband carries out adulterous affairs outside of the code of adultery and the Code of Hammurabi, then he must provide for her and she can divorce him and go back home. And then a code of slavery, because slavery was part of Babylonian society. From the beginning of civilization, perhaps from the time humans first settled down to farm, slavery has been part of human existence. And so too in the Code of Hammurabi, there are elaborate rules about slaves. Killing a slave is a far less heinous crime than killing a free individual. The fine is much less. Nonetheless, the slave is recognized as having rights. The murder of a slave is a crime. If you free a slave and document that freedom by contract, then you can never take that slave back and demand that he be enchained once again. So slaves as well have rights. And then what I would call the first minimum wage law. The Code of Hammurabi carefully spells out what the appropriate sum of money is to pay someone for labor. And almost all of these jobs that have a wage assigned to them are those that would be held by poor people. And this is a means of ensuring that these poor people are not oppressed and taken advantage of. If I clean out your water ditch, then I receive a specific sum of money. If I carry away your garbage every day, I receive a specific sum of money, and you cannot go below it. So minimum wage, sanctity of adoption, family law, a criminal code that gives rights to the victims as well as the criminal. This was the Code of Hammurabi. And it echoed down through the centuries, just the way Hammurabi said it would. And there in the Code of Hammurabi, we find fundamental elements in the two great systems of jurisprudence that still guide our world today. The Code of Justinian, the Roman law, in the belief that God gives law to the human race to protect everyone, and in the English common law, which echoes the profound words of Hammurabi, even the king is under the law. So Hammurabi has his place there in the Supreme Court of our country and there in the House of Representatives, where portraits of that great ruler of ancient Babylon still serve as a model for our courts and Congress today.